For well over 2 years into the COVID era, the headline number of COVID deaths, and the one most prominently figured on the UK government COVID dashboard, were those defined as anybody dying within 28 days of a positive PCR test. While the chart of such deaths is still prominently displayed on the dashboard, this is from today, it's no longer the first chart shown. Instead, the first chart shown, as I'll show by scrolling up here, is the apparently more reasonable number of deaths with COVID on the death certificate. So you'd think there'd be more likely to be deaths caused by COVID than just potentially many coincidental ones within 28 days of a positive test. But if you look at the dashboard today, and I've filtered it for England, I'll explain why in a minute, there's an uncanny likeness between these two different ways of counting COVID deaths. And we'd expect them to be very different. So just superficially looking at them, they look pretty much the same. But you can actually look at the data table here, which tells you the total cumulative numbers. So this is deaths with COVID on a death certificate. The latest cumulative total is 192,231. Remember that figure, 192,231, because when you look down at the deaths within 28 days of a positive test, and we click on the data table for that, it is 192,320. These are almost identical. That's a freakish likeness for numbers which should surely be very different. Now, when I was researching this, I actually assumed these figures must be wrong, because when I looked at the dashboard filtered for the whole of the UK, which you can just do by set to the UK, you can see that something is very different. Because for the UK, so this is deaths with COVID on death certificate. If we look at the data table for that, as you'd expect, there's a higher number of total deaths with COVID on death certificate for the whole of the UK than there were for England. And if you look at it for within 28 days of a positive test, it's only 178,000. So it's actually much lower for the whole of the UK than England. But of course it turns out that actually that only goes up to May 2022. Go back to the data table and you can see it's exactly a year earlier. So they appear to have stopped recording this for the whole of the UK in 2022. Let's go back to the England only one. So we're back to these two very similar graphs, COVID on death certificate, deaths within 28 days of positive test. So even if we assume that the UK figures are correct, there's still a fundamental problem, because we would expect the total deaths within 28 days of a positive test to be much greater than the total dying with COVID on the death certificate. That's because surely almost all of the ones dying with COVID on a death certificate would have tested positive within 28 days. And we'd expect many of those dying within 28 days of a positive test to have died from causes other than COVID, and hence that COVID should not be on the death certificate of those people. So why are these numbers essentially identical? In fact, it gets even stranger, because if we look at the cumulative totals up to the end of December 2021, that was the period that covered the 2 main years of the pandemic, we see something also interesting. So let's just go to the data table here. We'll scroll down to the end of 2021. So there you can see, on the last day of 2021, there are 151,221 deaths with COVID on the death certificate. And if we go now and look at the same data for deaths within 28 days of a positive test, we'd expect this, of course, to be much higher. What do we find? It's 130,756. It's like over 20,000 less. So there are more people dying with COVID as a cause on a death certificate than those testing positive within 28 days of death. Now, this is really strange. I mean, it's partly explained by the fact that in the first few months, i.e. before mass PCR testing, some people dying with COVID were diagnosed based on symptoms alone, but since the early summer of 2020, with everybody entering hospital for any reason being tested almost daily, and everybody then even trying to go back to work or school being tested almost daily, it's inconceivable that a person could die with COVID listed as a cause unless they'd had a positive test within 28 days. Now, it's true that the number of deaths within 28 days of a positive test has been gradually catching up to be almost exactly equal today. The only way to explain why the numbers are still so similar seems to be that, well, almost every person dying within 28 days of a positive test must, for a very long period, have automatically had COVID listed as a cause written on the death certificate. And that's something that the government assured us was absolutely not happening. Secondly, even after the introduction of mass PCR testing, many people would have somehow been determined to have died because of COVID without any tests, which I think is just not realistic. And the thing is that there's other data which confirm that the figures for total deaths with COVID on their death certificate must be a massive exaggeration of the true number of COVID deaths, because that's all you can really conclude from these data. Of course, there's other data which confirm that the figures for total deaths with COVID on a death certificate must be a massive exaggeration of the true number of COVID deaths. So consider, for example, the total mentioned above of 151,088 deaths in England up to the end of December 2021 with COVID on the death certificate. Now, this figure is nonsensical given this response to an FOI asking for number of deaths where COVID was the only cause mentioned on the death certificate. The response confirmed that less than 5% of all the officially classified COVID deaths in England and Wales up to the end of December 2021 listed COVID as the only cause of death on the death certificate. So what can we conclude from all this? Well, it's a statistical freak only that as of today, the total number of England deaths with COVID on a death certificate is almost exactly equal to the total number of deaths within 28 days of a positive test. Also, the COVID death numbers for the UK, as stated on the UK government dashboard, have been and continue to be massively exaggerated.